The sky has always been important to the world of myth. As the home of the gods, it was ruled by the seven great lights: Mercury, the smallest light, and Venus, the morning star; Saturn, the most distant; Mars, the red, and Jupiter, the brightest. But those five combined pale in comparison to the two primary lights of the sky, the sun and the moon. One rules the day, the other the night, and their movements in the sky set the seasons and dictate the format of our calendars. They are Helios and Selene, Mithras and Ma, Ra and Khonsu. They pursue one another across the sky, and stories are told about their separation from one another, rivalries between them, and how each waxes and wanes through the weeks or the seasons. But as the Jews drifted toward monotheism, these deities found themselves demoted to mere mortals, and the stories of gods became stories of men and women, like Samson and Delilah. And when later editors needed a polemic against the old monarchy, they recast their old gods as prophets and exalted them over the power of the kings. I'm your host, Jason, and you're listening to Dragons in Genesis. Every ancient culture understood the sun's importance and created gods to represent the most prominent light in the heavens, prompting the construction of magnificent temples and shrines to honor the sun and track its course across the sky. From the Great Pyramids of Giza in Egypt to Pueblo Bonito in northern New Mexico, ancient monuments to the sun still exist today. But the impact of these ancient ideas isn't constrained to stone buildings from the dawn of civilization. Sun worship is still alive today, though most people probably wouldn't recognize it. Many churches, temples, and mosques are deliberately arranged in an east-west orientation, so the main entrance faces either the rising or the setting of the sun, a practice that dates back many thousands of years. Our calendars and most sacred holidays are derived from the movements of the sun and its effects on the growing and harvest of crops, such as Christmas, Easter, and Thanksgiving. To this day, some Christians stipulate that upon their death they are to be buried facing east, so their resurrected bodies can sit up and face the Messiah when he returns on the day of judgment. And just as the light of the world was replaced with Jesus, so too were other sun god myths replaced with magic men and prophets. We pick up our study of 1 Kings with chapter 17 of that book and the beginning of Elijah's story. If you're just joining us, you may want to go back to episode 60 where our coverage of the book of Kings began. Let's set the stage. After the death of Omri, the king of the northern kingdom of Israel, his son Ahab took the throne. This family, called the Omrides, established the real golden age of Israel. Many of their expansions, advancements, and building projects, including palaces, stables, trade routes, foreign alliances, and fortifications, would later be attributed to rulers of the southern kingdom of Judah, such as Solomon. Of course, since this book is written from the point of view of that southern kingdom, and they consider the northern neighbors to be rivals, every ruler in the north, especially the Omrides, were considered to be terrible people. And the sin that makes them evil is doing what displeased Yahweh. This is code for setting up shrines, making sacrifices at those shrines, and using idols in their worship. We should note here that nearly every southern king is likewise guilty of those same crimes. The introduction of each king of Judah typically states that they pleased Yahweh, but either built shrines or allowed the existing shrines to continue operation. So the northern and southern kings were doing pretty much the same things, but Yahweh ignored the sins of the southern kings while punishing the northerners for those same offenses. Why would the authors do this? The reasoning is simple. The authors of the books of Samuel and Kings were writing after the Babylonian exile, and we know this because they repeatedly mentioned the exile. In the post-exilic period, there was no king of Israel. The land had been conquered by Babylon, which was in turn conquered by Persia. The Persians then placed a governor in charge of their newly acquired land in place of a king. So the Jewish authors decided to write a history book that explained why they no longer had kings. They were also moving toward a new style of worship. This transition began about a century or so earlier, but was accelerated after the Persians took control of the region and constructed a temple complex in Jerusalem. So, from the point of view of these authors, everyone in the past had engaged in improper worship. But since these were writings from the southern kingdom, the northern kings were more guilty. So, with all of that out of the way, let's get started with the story of Elijah. In chapter 17, the prophet Elijah punishes King Ahab and the land of Israel by behaving like a typical sun god and causing a prolonged drought. This control over the sun to punish the wicked was also used by Moses and Joshua. Elijah has other parallels to these figures, but we'll get to those later. One detail of note here is that it is Elijah himself who controls the weather. The first verse of 1 Kings 17 tells us that Elijah announced he was causing a drought. He wasn't announcing a drought that Yahweh was causing. This was Elijah's own power. This also occurred with Moses and Joshua, but the redactors added phrases to diminish those characters' power and give Yahweh the credit. Why would they do this? Because the cults of Moses and Joshua were quite popular, and the redactors felt threatened by that popularity. Just look at the name of Moses. Moshe means he draws out, meaning it was Moses who drew the people out of Egypt through the Sea of Reeds, not that he was drawn out of the Nile. That story was inserted to change the meaning of his name. Had his name meant he was drawn out, it would have been Meshuai, not Moshe. We see this in a midrash which states that Moses got his name for drawing the people out of Egypt. So Elijah, who swears on the name of Yahweh but doesn't invoke his powers, works his own magic and causes a drought. Then Yahweh tells Elijah to go into the wilderness in the east and wait there. But, like Moses, he'll need to be fed while in the wilderness. So Yahweh says he will send ravens to feed him. Wild birds feeding Elijah could be support for an argument that he's a Disney princess, but don't get too excited about an Elijah musical just yet. We may be dealing with a mistranslation here. The word for ravens and the word for Arabs are similar in Hebrew. So there may have been a group of Arabs in the Wadi who shared their food with Elijah. Later we'll learn that, like Esau, Elijah is covered in body hair, so there's another strike against the Disney princess hypothesis. So Elijah actively works against King Ahab, a polemic by the writers to exalt the power of the prophets over the authority of the kings, which will continue in the next book. He declares 3 years of famine and drought against the kingship to show priestly power as being superior to that of the old divine kings. This was also illustrated when Moses brought plagues against the Pharaoh in the story of Exodus. After Yahweh sent Elijah to the Wadi to hide, the Wadi dried up because of the drought, so there's not much in the way of forethought here. So Yahweh tells Elijah to leave the area and travel to Sidon and stay with a widow who lives there. As soon as he arrived, he met the widow who was gathering wood. And hopefully this wasn't on the Sabbath, otherwise she'd have to be killed. As soon as he met her, he demanded she bring him water and bread, which is kind of rude if you ask me. As she's making the bread, she told Elijah that she had precious little flour and oil. So she and her son have resigned themselves to eat sticks and then die of starvation. I guess Yahweh and his prophets didn't realize that punishing the entire land might affect the people as well as the king. So we're then treated to a tale meant to endear the prophet to the poor and the oppressed. Elijah decides to work his second miracle. He tells the widow to start making bread and the last jars of flour and oil would not run out until the drought has lifted and the rains have returned. This passage is often used by prosperity gospel pastors who say, "When you have only a little, you should still give to the prophets of the Lord." Meaning that even if you're poor and can't afford to pay your bills, you should still send money to the megachurch pastor. The widow makes a ton of bread and the flour doesn't run out. This is similar to Moses providing food for the Israelites in Exodus 16, Numbers 11, and Deuteronomy 8, and it will also be recycled for Jesus in the Gospels. His sun god powers continue in verses 17 to 24 when the widow's son drops dead from a sunstroke, also caused by the heat wave brought on by the prophet. As a widow, losing her only son would remove her only chance for financial security. We see this story recycled in Luke 7:12. The widow asks if this is her reward for her charity to one of Yahweh's prophets. So Elijah carries the boy to his bed and lays on top of him, transferring his body heat and life force into the child, bringing the boy back to life. This is similar to the miracle Jesus worked on Jairus' daughter in Mark 5. Chapter 18 skips ahead 3 years to the end of the drought and the showdown between the prophets of Baal and the lone prophet of Yahweh. Jezebel, King Ahab's wife, was killing off the prophets of Yahweh, so Obadiah, the palace steward, hid 100 of them in a nearby cave. At this time, 2 things occurred. First, Yahweh told Elijah to confront Ahab, and second, Ahab realized that grass needed to be gathered to prevent all the horses and mules in the country from dying. So Ahab and Obadiah, being the only 2 named characters in the story, each set out in a different direction to gather enough grass to feed all the livestock in the kingdom of Israel. Not sure why the king didn't delegate this to, say, the people who owned and cared for their animals, but it's a story, and it needs a way to move the action along, so we'll roll with it. While on the road searching for grass, Obadiah bumped into Elijah, and the prophet told the steward to bring him before the king. But Obadiah somehow knew that eventually Elijah would fly into heaven on a flaming chariot in the sequel to this book, and even said as much, expressing his fears that the prophet would fly away before he could summon the king, and this would anger King Ahab. So he made Elijah promise not to do this until Book 2. So Elijah promises to meet with King Ahab that very day and not follow Enoch into the wild blue yonder until later. When Ahab and Elijah meet, Ahab rightfully blames the prophet for the drought and famine, but Elijah turns the tables on him and says to the king that it was the king and his father who brought the troubles on themselves by forsaking the commandments and following the old Canaanite gods and using idols. He then challenges the prophets of the old gods to a prophet battle on Mount Carmel. So all of Israel assemble at the mountain for the showdown between 450 prophets of Baal, 450 prophets of the goddess Asherah, and their opponent, Elijah, the solitary prophet of Yahweh. Jezebel's prophets would gather around one altar and Elijah would stand alone before the other. They would each sacrifice a young bull to their respective god, but they weren't allowed to set the altar on fire, which was required for this type of offering. Whichever god was willing to set the altar on fire themselves was the true God and the deity that the nation of Israel should worship. The prophets of the Baalim, which is the plural form for God, chanted and shouted and even poured out their own blood, but they couldn't get their gods to light the altar on fire. So Elijah began mocking them, stating that Baal may be caught up in conversation, or detained, or on a journey, or asleep, and that's why he couldn't be troubled to light the fire. Elijah then repairs the damages to the altar of Yahweh, placing on it 12 stones, one for each tribe of Israel, and piled wood on the altar. Then he laid the bowl on it and had the people make the miracle more challenging by covering everything in water. Once it was completely saturated, he invoked the power of Yahweh and another sun miracle occurred. Fire fell from the sky and ignited the altar, consuming the offering, the stone altar, and even the damp earth beneath. This prompted the people to begin chanting, "Yahweh alone is God." So this story not only serves to reject the old gods and styles of worship and reject prophets of those gods, but it also serves as an ideological tale for a later chant that was used in Israel for Yahweh worship. Elijah then had the gathered people seize the prophets and sacrifice them to Yahweh, which put an end to the drought and brought rain to the land. The human sacrifice to Yahweh to end famine was also seen in 2 Samuel 24. Ahab rode a chariot all the way to Jezreel in an attempt to beat the rain, but with the help of Yahweh, Elijah was able to outrun the king and stayed ahead of the chariot all the way there. In chapter 19, Ahab informed Jezebel, his wife, that all of her prophets had been slain, so she sent a messenger to Elijah to threaten his life, which prompted Elijah to flee to Beersheba in Judah. This makes little sense in the context, as he has the power to call down fire from heaven to set things ablaze, and he just converted the entire nation of Israel to his religion and can simply order them to put anyone to death, as he just did at the end of the previous chapter. It's another parallel with Moses, a righteous prophet who is in exile in the wilderness, but will be called by Yahweh to become great. The editors just placed it in the wrong spot. It should have been inserted before the prophet battle, not after, unless it is supposed to mirror the story of Moses in Exodus 2 through 3. It's our second story of Elijah in the wilderness, and the second time Yahweh sends someone to feed him. Instead of ravens or Arabs, he sends an angel to bring him food while he sleeps beneath a tree in the wilderness. Elijah, having fled for his life, is now wishing that he was dead. I guess if he wanted to die, he could have just hung out with Jezebel to accomplish that. But the angel who's been feeding him comes along and bolsters his spirit. After traveling 40 days and nights, Elijah arrives at Mount Horeb. If Horeb sounds familiar, it was mentioned in Exodus 3:1, where Moses, also a fugitive from murder, fled into the wilderness and encountered Yahweh, where he was given a holy mission, just as is about to occur with Elijah. And according to Deuteronomy, it was the Mount Horeb where Moses received the 10 Commandments, and Elijah is said to enter a cave there. I'm sorry, not a cave, but the cave. We're to understand that Elijah is standing in the same place where Moses communed with Yahweh many books earlier. So Elijah arrives at Mount Horeb, the home of Yahweh, and the god is confused as to why the prophet is there. Apparently he forgot that he'd used an angel to send the prophet to this mountain. Now Yahweh has long been associated with volcano imagery, probably because he was originally a volcano god. So we shouldn't be surprised to see it appear in 1 Kings. There's a great wind, fire, earthquakes, splitting rocks, shaking mountains, and a tremendous thunder, all coming from the mountain of God. But we then see a break from this traditional scene that has become so familiar. The authors, if you recall, are trying to get away from the visible deities of their past and embrace a more cosmic god, like Ahura Mazda from Persia. A god that isn't represented by the old imagery. So there's a phrase inserted into the story immediately after the familiar volcano imagery appears. It states that Yahweh isn't in those signs. Instead, Yahweh is a small, still voice. But if inaction denotes the presence of a deity instead of action, does that mean that the fire miracle in the previous chapter wasn't proof of Yahweh, but the silence that greeted the prophets was actual proof of Baal? I guess it's best not to think about that too much. Just as Yahweh used Samuel to usurp King Saul in the book of Samuel, we get a repeat of that here when he uses Elijah to usurp the power of King Ahab. Yahweh tells Elijah to anoint Jehu, the son of Nimshi, as king of Israel. He's also to anoint Hazael as the new king of Aram and to name Elisha to be the next prophet. Hazael the Aramean will kill many Israelites, and any who escape him will be slain by Jehu, who will become their new king, and any who escape him will be slain by Elisha, so that only 7,000 people will survive. So Yahweh is here commanding genocide against his own chosen people. And we have to remind ourselves that these are the people who just recently converted to Yahwism. Elijah finds Elisha plowing a field and asks him to leave everything behind and follow him. Without question, Elisha slaughtered all of his oxen and gave the meat to the poor, leaving behind his livelihood to follow a strange prophet and setting the standard for the disciples of Jesus when those stories are later written. This provides a sort of apostolic succession to link the current generations of prophets with a fictive founder of their order, just as the Catholic Church invented a succession of popes in order to fill the gap between the inception of their church in the 4th century and the time of Jesus 300 years earlier. But this tale had an even older and more primitive purpose. Elijah was driving 12 yoke of oxen. The night sky held 12 constellations that were used to mark the year, the 12 signs of the zodiac. And who rules over the night sky? Well, the moon, of course. And just as the moon follows the sun, Elisha follows Elijah. This was originally a story about the cycle of day and night. In chapter 20, King Ben-Hadad of Aram attacked King Ahab's capital city of Samaria and demanded gold, silver, women, and children. Ahab agreed to the gold and silver, but wasn't going to hand over his people. He was told by one of his prophets that Yahweh would deliver the Arameans into his hands, so he mustered all the men who could fight, and they marched on the city. Ben-Hadad thought they were about to surrender and allowed them to approach, but the men surprised him by attacking, and the Arameans were scattered. Ben-Hadad's advisors reminded him that Yahweh was a mountain god, and he should fight on the plains, as had been done in Judges 1:19, where Yahweh was defeated by iron chariots. So he raised an army of chariots and tried again. The authors forgot about Yahweh's weakness to iron wagons, and the god was able to defeat them in battle. The Israelites struck down 100,000 of them in a single day, and they fled. But the city where they took refuge collapsed on them, and many were killed. So Ben-Hadad offers to return the towns that his father had captured. So Ahab and Ben-Hadad made peace, and Ben-Hadad was sent home instead of being killed. At this point, chapter 20, verse 35, an anonymous prophet makes an appearance for the first time in the story, though, according to Josephus, this man of God is Micaiah, who prominently features in chapter 22. He's a member of a band of prophets that's later referenced in 2 Kings chapters 2, 4, 5, 6, and 9, but first appears here in 1 Kings 20. This mysterious man, who may or may not be Micaiah, doesn't want to appear to be a prophet when he approaches King Ahab, so he commands one of his companions to strike him and give him an injury. His companion disobeys, so the anonymous prophet cursed him to be killed by a lion for disobedience. This theme will pop up again before our story is done. In fact, if you displease Yahweh or his associates in the books of Kings, there's a pretty good chance that you'll be attacked by wild animals as a result. Anyway, as soon as they part ways, a random lion appeared and killed the guy, so the prophet asked another companion to strike him. Not wanting to meet with another of Yahweh's murder cats, he punched the prophet in the face. The prophet then donned a disguise and waited by the road for the king. When Ahab arrived, the disguised prophet told him that he had been in charge of watching over a prisoner from the battle, but had accidentally let the prisoner escape. Ahab declared that for the crime of letting an enemy escape, he must be held responsible. The mysterious man flung off his disguise and revealed himself as a prophet, and that he had just tricked the king in pronouncing judgment on himself. You see, King Ahab had allowed King Ben-Hadad to escape destruction, and thus Yahweh would make King Ahab's life forfeit. This too occurred with King Saul, and his descendants were eventually punished by being impaled on a hilltop as a sacrifice to Yahweh at the end of 2 Samuel. When Yahweh commands destruction, he wants the total annihilation of his enemies. In chapter 21, we return to the wickedness of Jezebel with the story of Naboth's vineyard. Just outside of King Ahab's palace in Samaria lived a man named Naboth who owned a vineyard, and Ahab wished to purchase this prime real estate in order to plant a vegetable garden. But apparently Yahweh himself had instructed Naboth to never sell his land. It seems Yahweh has very specific instructions for the people in these books. Ahab doesn't take the rejection well and openly pouts about his lack of a vegetable garden. So his wife Jezebel decides to settle the matter. She uses Ahab's royal seal to arrange for Naboth's arrest on trumped-up charges. He's promptly taken into custody, found guilty, and executed by stoning. Once Naboth was out of the way, Jezebel informed her husband that he could take possession of the vineyard. Naturally, because this is the direction the story is already headed, Yahweh was angered by this, so he told Elijah to confront Ahab, giving specific instructions on what to say to the king of Israel. The prophet went to the king and informed him that in the field where Naboth's blood was lapped up by dogs is where dogs would soon lap up the king's blood, and Jezebel will be eaten by dogs along with everyone in Ahab's line who dies in the city. His descendants who die in the countryside will all be devoured by birds. All of this because Jezebel led Israel astray. Apparently Yahweh really likes for wild animals to eat people in the books of Kings. But Yahweh isn't going to kill Ahab because Ahab repented. Instead, he's going to punish Ahab's children. So again, we have children being punished for the sins of the father. And in this case, the father is spared. Chapter 22 begins by telling us that the Arameans and the Israelites had no war for 3 years. Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, approached the king of Israel asking for help in liberating a city that had been conquered by the Arameans. King Ahab agreed to help, but suggested they consult with Yahweh first, so the king gathers 400 prophets of Yahweh and asks if they should march on Ramoth-Gilead, and all of them said that Yahweh would grant them victory. But there was one little problem. Yahweh sent his lying spirit into the mouths of the prophets to encourage Israel to march on the city. However, one prophet, Micaiah, spoke the truth. But the king never liked Micaiah because he always spoke of misfortune, so the prophet was locked in prison and the Israelites marched on to war. During the battle, King Ahab was struck by an arrow and later died. The bloody chariot that he was pinned to was taken back to Samaria and washed in a pool where dogs lapped up his blood and whores bathed in the bloody waters, according to Yahweh's threat. Then we get into a formulaic passage that we're going to see over and over again in the coming chapters. It states that other events of Ahab's reign are recorded in the annals of the kings of Israel, and his son Ahaziah succeeded him as king. This is a reference to the source material for some of the details concerning the kings mentioned in these books. The authors are borrowing some information from the Annals of the Kings of Israel and the Annals of the Kings of Judah, and then crafting theological tales around the characters to argue against the idea of the monarchy. We're then told that during the 4th year of Ahab's reign is when Jehoshaphat became king of Judah. Unlike the kings of Israel, this king of Judah pleased Yahweh, but he also left the shrines and temples in place and submitted to the authority of Israel. So people actively worshiping other gods in Judah is allowed, but it's punishable by death in Israel. A bit of a double standard, I guess. Near the end of chapter 22, we learn that Jehoshaphat removed the remaining male prostitutes that practiced in the temple. This is a reference to sacred prostitution that was prominent in many ancient cultures, but the Israelites eventually banned the practice. Jehoshaphat also attempted to build a trade fleet, but apparently desert dwellers don't make good sailors, and all of their ships wrecked. The story of Elijah continues in the first 2 chapters of 2 Kings, so we'll hop over there to finish up this episode. The nation of Moab rebels against Israel following King Ahab's death. His son and successor, Ahaziah, was injured in a fall, and he sent messengers to inquire about his health with the god Baal-zebub of Ekron. Because he consulted a foreign god instead of his local deity, which was Yahweh, Yahweh decided that the king must die. He sends Elijah to intercept the messengers and inform them of Yahweh's decision. They report the bad news to King Ahaziah, who recognizes the description of the hairy man as the prophet Elijah. This is one of the few instances in the entire Bible when we get a physical description of a character. When such a description occurs, it's always meaningful, such as Esau being likewise hairy, or the long hair of Samson. And, like Elijah, both of these hairy men have been associated with the sun. Ahaziah sends 50 men to collect Elijah and bring him to the palace, but when they arrive at the hilltop where the prophet was waiting, he called down fire from heaven and burned them all alive. So Ahaziah sent another 50 men, and Elijah cooked them as well. A third group approached, but this time they begged for Elijah to come down with them. This time Yahweh sent an angel to stay Elijah's wrath, so he quit casting fire spells and accompanied the soldiers to Ahaziah's palace. There, he just repeats the words he had spoken to Ahaziah's messengers, that the king would die for consulting a foreign deity when he should have spoken with his local god. He, of course, died, and like his father, we are told that the other events of his reign are recorded in the Annals of the Kings of Israel, and his son Jehoram succeeded him as king. There are a couple of things to point out here. First, this story parallels the Witch of Endor scene that we saw in 1 Samuel 28. There, King Saul goes to consult a forbidden oracle to likewise inquire of his impending doom. In both stories, the king is met by a prophet of Yahweh. Samuel's ghost in the first story, Elijah in the second. In both stories, the prophet is recognized by his distinctive dress, the long robe of Samuel and the hair and belt of Elijah. And in both tales, the prophet informs the king that he will soon die. These are 2 cautionary tales warning against divination. That's a practice for the priests of the temple, not a random oracle. The second detail of note is the god Ahaziah wishes to consult. Baal-zebub of Ekron isn't an actual god. The god being referenced here is Baal-zebul, meaning Lord of the Manor or Prince of the Palace. This was a distinguished god that ruled a heavenly house, as is mentioned in the Testament of Solomon. He's associated with the planet Venus, one of the 7 great lights of the sky. So why the name change? The authors are mocking the god and his priests by misspelling his name through the change of a single letter. Lord of the Manor becomes Lord of the Flies. essentially saying that this foreign god is a pile of dung that attracts false prophets to him like flies. He has since been used as a great demon and the inspiration for the title of a famous novel. Chapter 2 of 2 Kings brings the story of Elijah to a close and rounds out the growing list of solar imagery associated with the character with a couple more miracles. Elijah and his disciple Elisha set out on a journey to the Jordan so that Yahweh can take him up in a whirlwind to heaven instead of dying. This is exactly what happened in Genesis with Enoch, who is also associated with the Son and ascended bodily into heaven in a whirlwind instead of dying. They traveled first to Bethel and informed their disciples of Elijah's impending ascent, then on to Jericho to do the same. Remember, in the last episode, a man named Hiel decided to renovate the rubble of the destroyed city of Jericho, but he had to first sacrifice his children to Yahweh in order to begin construction, per Yahweh's command. So now people are living in the city, and Elijah had some prophet disciples among them. 50 disciples in total followed them to the Jordan, where Joshua and the Israelites had crossed, and Elijah strikes the water with his staff, dividing the river so they can cross on dry land. If you needed further convincing that Elijah is another Moses, here it is. After the crossing, Elisha asks if he can have a double portion of Elijah's spirit after the prophet flies away. Elijah agrees under the condition that Elisha faces him during his ascent. This is because the ancients understood that the moon received its light from the sun, and when it faced the sun, it grew full. For a written example of this knowledge, go back to episode 52, where we covered the book of astronomy that is contained in 1 Enoch. A fiery chariot drawn by fiery horses swooped down and took Elijah up into heaven, just like Helios the sun god. Also, there was a whirlwind. So maybe it was like one of those horrifying fire tornadoes that you see during a massive wildfire? I'm not really sure. We're told that this is how Elijah and Elisha were separated from one another. Of course they were separated. That's what happens when one person goes to heaven and the other is still on earth. So why does the author feel the need to point out that the two separated people are now separate? Because mythology is littered with tales of how the sun and moon were once together, but are now separated, doomed to forever follow one another across the sky, either attempting to be reunited or attempting to usurp one another, depending on the legend. Often these legends have a story about the moon being split in half, but not this one. Except that in the very next verse, verse 12, it says that when Elisha could no longer see Elijah, he tore his garments in half. Normally, when someone is distressed, it is said that he rent his garments, not tore them in half, as Elisha has done. The disciples declare that the spirit of Elijah had settled on Elisha, and they offer to search the mountaintops for 3 days in case Elijah had descended to one of those. When the sun sinks to its lowest point in the middle of winter, it appears to remain at that latitude for about 3 days, before slowly beginning to move north again to signify the halfway point of winter has passed and spring is on its way. This is why so many sun gods have stories in which they're dead or gone or imprisoned for 3 days, often in darkness, before they reappear triumphant. Elisha then repeats Elijah's miracle by striking the water with the prophet's staff and dividing the Jordan so they can all cross on dry land. It's the first of many times that the moon god will follow in his mentor's footsteps. But that's a topic for another episode. That's going to wrap it up for this episode of Dragons in Genesis. If you'd like to support the show, there's an Amazon wish list in a pinned post on my Facebook page. The books in that list help with research for future episodes. You can also shop the merchandise from my Zazzle store, which can also be found on that same post. Just visit facebook.com/dragonsofgenesis. And you can support me on Patreon at patreon.com/dragonsofgenesis. If you have any questions regarding mythology in the Bible, send them to me at dragonsandgenesis@gmail.com, and I'll answer your question in a video on my YouTube channel over at youtube.com/dragonsandgenesis podcast. Don't forget to give a review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast, and check out the website at dragonsandgenesis.com for links, episode information, and a list of recommended reading. And as always, thank you for listening.